Hello, everybody. I hope you had a productive and interesting conversation. I think we also had in our group on oceans a really fascinating and deep conversation around some of the practicalities, but also around some inspiring examples and the theory of what could be done. So I'm going to take us through now each of the missions and ask the facilitators of each session, so 2 sessions per mission, so 2 facilitators per mission, to feed back the key points from their sessions. So all of the things that you've said, all of the things that have been recorded on the Padlets are part of the final output. As you know, the session was recorded, so nothing's lost. Even if during the feedback you miss, we don't talk about or we skip over the points that you made, it will still be there. It's part of the output, so don't feel you've been forgotten. I'm going to ask people to step through, as I say, mission by mission, and I'm going to try at the end to draw together some of the key lessons, some of the key thoughts, some of the connecting elements. So you should be able to see on my screen the first of the Padlets, which was from the first climate group, and I'm going to ask my colleague Juan to talk us through that and give us some couple of minutes on the key points that came out of that first session.
Well, I think it was more or less the same for the 2 of them. There was some challenge about how to build a co-narrative, co-design a narrative among the different missions to have a common approach. Also, the missions understood as a connector between existing initiatives, and at the same time, how to implement a methodology, a standard methodology. So we were running from how to be flexible enough to adapt to each region that had a different speed and were in a different phase, and how to be able to have a common structure that allows us to exchange information and resources. So that will be some of the key points for the first session. Do you want me to go to the second one, or we wait for?
Yeah, I think I'll just skip across. I think it's really interesting just picking up that first point about because here we're talking about climate, of course. That the regions being in different places, they're also obviously in very different situations. They're more or less immediately affected, and although it's a general problem, it's a problem that is both general and felt in a very differentiated, very specific way. So that's quite interesting. And I can already see a couple of the themes that you talked about came up in our session on oceans too. So tell us a little bit about what were the governance and structures that people felt could be helpful in this.
Yes, for example, we've got the idea, again, was coming from, there was this tension between bottom-up and top-down processes. And if we need a bigger structure that allows us to implement all the missions, or if we could go with smaller structures around existing programs and institutions that would help bottom-up process to implement. So how to set a network in a micro-institutional transformation. So that will be in the second part, some of the tension that we saw. For sure, the need of mapping, methodologies, etc.
Okay, thank you very much, Juan, and thank you to all of the participants in Juan's group. I can see there's loads of great content there. I'm going to switch to the other group now, to the second group looking at climate, and that was facilitated by Alexa Ward. So Alexa, can you talk us through the content and the ideas that came out of your first session?
Yes, absolutely. And my apologies to all of my group members whose ideas don't make it across in this brief presentation back. I think our conversation started around examples that people were bringing to the table of other programs that had both knowledge sharing or best practice sharing as part of them. And sort of one of the things that countries and regions are contributing is their participation and their sharing of their own local examples into these sorts of forums. Communication was a big part of both our first and second discussions, but in the context of the first discussion, one of the things that countries and regions are contributing is spreading the message, whether that is amongst their peers, or as well to civil society and citizens groups within their countries or regions. We did talk a little bit about the involvement of citizens, why that's necessary to the implementation, and how that can be facilitated by the arrangement of country and regional plans. There was also a discussion about funding during this first session, both in terms of that's an expectation of one of the things that countries and regions are contributing, but also what that means in terms of what we want that funding to look like if we do need to involve citizens. So is there a misalignment from sort of the timescales that citizens are involved versus the timescales of funding, and needing to make sure that that's addressed? And then there was talk about alignment as well between the missions and existing adaptation and climate adaptation plans. So making sure that alignment is happening on multiple scales.
Really interesting. I think the idea of having the countries and regions as kind of connectors between local action, local situations, and the European narrative and the connected mission is a really interesting one. So what did your group think about institutional structures and governance?
Interestingly, that final point about the narrative was a major point of our governance and infrastructure discussion as well, in part because there's a need from the perspective of people in the room to shift both the mindset and the understanding of a lot of different actors and stakeholders who are going to be needed to be involved in the implementation of the missions. Right now, there's a sort of understanding of a grant application is sort of research and innovation that's more similar to Horizon Europe, but understanding that that is only a catalyst, and this goes much beyond research and innovation into thinking more about public procurement and spatial planning and the implementation of all of these things. And so how can we tell the full story about this? What sort of infrastructures allow us to tell that full story right from the outset so that a lot of different actors can be involved? So we spent quite a bit of time talking about that. We also then talked a lot about funding again, and alignment, and what sort of governance structures are going to make that possible, and what sort of either carrots and sticks as part of that are going to ensure that funding gets us closer to the climate adaptation goals. And we want to have an easier time both within the governance structures and more broadly understanding the varying and complex information that's part of the missions. So we need some assistance with that. We also had some questions about political involvement and whose responsibility was that, and how to build that into the governance structures. But there was a lot of, as you can see, post-its that came out of this second discussion that I can't quite do justice to.
There's a lot here, there really is. So thank you very much for that, Alexa. So those are the conversations on climate, lots of stuff in common, as you can see, but also lots of new ideas and different ideas. We're moving on to cancer now. And the first group that was looking at cancer was looked after by Annie Cook. So Annie, can you just talk us through what came out of your first session? How can countries and regions contribute to the missions?
Yeah, so I've tried to cluster them a wee bit, but as you can see, there's post-it notes everywhere. So yeah, we spoke again about funding and cooperation and alignment. So how funding research could align to the cancer missions from a community perspective, but also from an EU perspective as well. We spoke about connecting to national cancer plans structurally and financially. So looking at what already exists and how that connects locally, nationally, and on an EU level as well. And then we also spoke about how the framework of actions are not clear. So how can organisations contribute? How can they understand what activity and what actions they can take? So at the moment, it's quite highly formalised at a policy level, but not at a basis level where something can be done. So more indications on when to start and what can do. So we spoke a bit about how there's a link missing there. And clear expectations basically for what people can do and how they can contribute. And then the last point on that one was about citizen engagement. So how we can involve citizens, including patients, into these discussions. So a bit about having more of a integrated patient discussion and dialogue, and maybe success strategies for citizen engagement could be disseminated amongst countries as well.
That's really interesting there to think about, like when is a patient a citizen, and when are they a patient? Some really good stuff to unpack there. So thinking about structures and governance, what came out for you there?
I'm just looking at different points. I'm not sure. Are we on the next question? Sorry.
Next question.
So this one, we had national hubs and support. So this was a big topic of discussion. How we engage people in their native languages as well, and then what the lifetime of a hub looks like. So obviously this project's 10 years, and how can we engage and support people on a longer and persistent level, and then there needs to be more support in that. So there's a wee point here about several private cancer foundations are already in a dialogue on this. So how should we support them, or how could we support them in their journey, and how can we connect the networks together in different organisations? Communication was a massive topic. So how can we communicate clearly to different organisations, different networks? We should encourage private foundations to get in contact with each other and network with each other. So how can they work together? And it's important to establish maybe a clear communication strategy with the public. So working with different levels of people, different groups. And that kind of connects into the cross-sectoral approach. So how we engage with different national research communities, how that is coordinated and how it's aligned with the mission, and how the funding also connects into that. So they all work on their own priorities in different charities, but how can we get them to work together to address one united goal? And then the last point here was equity and cross-border working. So things like, how do we transfer knowledge? So patients, whether that's patients going cross-border or that's knowledge and sharing that. So an example is obviously we've learned a lot from the pandemic and doing things online. So using that learning and expertise and how we address inequity. So that was kind of the last point there.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. I particularly think that equity and inequity point is going to come up again, not just in cancer. It certainly came up for us. The second group on cancer was looked after by Martina. Martina, can you talk us through the answers that you came up with for the first session? How could countries and regions contribute to the missions?
Yes. So the first conversation that we had was around what is the relationship between the national or regional level and the EU level. The main point was that it is important to link those different levels and also maybe have a two-way conversation or a bi-directional conversation. So how can countries and regions contribute to the EU missions, and also the other way around? So how can the EU contribute to the national level? We also mentioned a few initiatives, projects, groups or stakeholders, actors that could be somehow involved or integrated into this conversation around the mission on cancer. And finally, another point was the need for more information or clarification on some points to be able to go into more detail in really defining or understanding how this contribution from countries and regions could be actually done and implemented. So I think that those were the three main points in our conversation.
Okay, thank you. And what about the second session, when we started thinking about the implementation structures and governance? What came out for you there?
Yes, somehow we built upon what came up in the first part. So again, we discussed around how the different levels could be integrated, and I think that what really emerged or came out of the conversation was that it is important, or it was considered important to have a clear direction, clear goals from the EU side, and at the same time enough flexibility to take into account the specificities and the characteristics of each country. Because of course each country has different needs or different characteristics. And we also spoke about the importance of having an interministerial governance. Having different ministries working together in order to have a wider perspective on the topic of cancer, not just on the health side, but also on the social, research, economy, and everything else that somehow is involved in this topic. Again, the topic of collaboration of different actors came up with a lot of contributions. So how to have different areas of knowledge collaborate, intersectoral collaboration, etc. So this idea of creating networks and collaboration. And again, the importance of having clarity and information came up as a way to make clear plans and implementation easier.
Yep, that's really interesting. Thank you very much for that. I think really reflects for me the balance of and the complexity of the missions as a concept, that you have a big goal, but actually the specifics of it are a little unclear, and it's trying to work out what's the way in which you can iteratively develop some of these ideas. So that was great. Thank you very much. So that was the conversation on cancer across the two groups. We're moving on next to cities, and the first group on cities was looked after by Pandora. So Pandora, what did your group come up with in answer to the first question?
Thank you, Anthony. Just to say, I'm feeding back on the conversations we had, not all of the comments. So just to make you aware of that, and I'm really sorry if we're not including any of your comments. We had some really interesting topics threading through both workshops. So they were around leadership, strategy, cooperation, indeed among a different cross-section of actors, but also incentives, research and funding. So in this first workshop, we heard the need to really engage everybody, so municipalities, companies, people, and really set goals and incentives so that we had a shared accountability. We had a really interesting conversation. How on earth do we enforce this? How do we hold each other to account? And people really kept coming back to the Climate City contract, and is there a template for this? We'd like to share some of the common components. And then an interesting point raised its head, which was research. Where does research fit into all of this? How does it align with some of the key things that are happening at the moment? And then quite a reflective group, my group. Why do we even need a mission today? Because many countries already have a contract, a goal, you know, they have kind of city plans and everything. So what's the value of the mission really? Mm-hmm. That was a good gateway into thinking about our structures and governance.
Okay, I've flipped the screen to the next one so we can go straight into that.
And people got very excited about the arrows in this one, so we were able to connect a bit more. And big themes here were the importance of supporting cooperation and training, especially across such a broad range of actors in the field. Again, the Climate City contract came up, having those common components, and we heard about some best practice examples in Sweden and Leuven for creating that contract. Then making sure that the research does thread in and that all actors are thoroughly recognised in the governance structures needed. Mm-hmm. And having strong political support and strategy on what's needed to be delivered. And then really thinking about how do we interact with one another? We are all connected. How do we connect better? What is the collaboration? People do want to change. So it was thinking about setting conditions for stakeholders and governance working together. So having that common approach, a common strategy with the right incentive. So not quite being able to nail down what those are. So that needs a bit more investigation. But my group felt that they linked in with policies and business models, and that around those structures could be created that really encourage cooperation, and that there's funding in place for all of the different processes within this mission.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Pandora. And I think one of the things that really strikes me is that so much of this conversation is about the connections between city work and other missions. And we in our mission, someone said in our conversation, oh, we should ask the city's mission about that. So there's lots of inter-mission connection, as well as lots of connection between different levels of government. Some really interesting thoughts there. Thank you very much. The other group that talked about cities was looked after by Matt Basford. So Matt, did you come up with some of the same points, something different? Talk us through your first session.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few crossovers there. Yeah, just to say, captured some of the kind of discussion was captured on the Padlet, but I know there was also furious note-taking happening in the background. So not everything will be on here, but there will be other points are not missed. But so to start off with, I've kind of clustered these a little bit, but there was a number of kind of questions and a few uncertainties about what was kind of planned at the moment. As we went on, there was a recognition that maybe comes with a different way of working, and there was a kind of desire to kind of stick with that and kind of explore that. There was also a number of comments about kind of linking up different levels and alignment across different levels, which is a kind of cluster that we see in the kind of bottom left. Around the kind of topic of funding, there were comments about the importance of kind of securing national funding and a number of different comments around this. And the other kind of themes, if we move over to the kind of top right, there was a number around how to reach widely, the importance of using existing platforms and networks, and of taking a kind of open innovation approach, as kind of mentioned on the far right there. And then moving on, so just to confuse things, I'm afraid I have kind of covered the second topic, second question on the same board. Just going to scroll towards the bottom. And I think it's fair to say more of the discussion here happened in the room, so less of the kind of clustering on the Padlet itself. But just to kind of touch on some of the points that came up here, the Climate City contract was mentioned as an important kind of practical tool. There was a discussion around, there's a lot of focus on local government currently, and it needs to kind of take account of other levels as well, and that there's kind of linked to that as a need for a kind of single joined up narrative across these different levels. So that's just a quick summary of some of the points that kind of came up.
That's really interesting, and I think that point about the Climate City contract is interesting, particularly because the question about accountability, is really live in that, and thinking about how the multiple actors, the big ambitions can be tied into something that doesn't, mean you're constantly looking over your shoulder, doesn't mean you're constantly looking at detail, but does give a sense of collective accountability and shared responsibility. Thank you very much for that, Matt. So the next conversation was about oceans. We had two groups looking at that as well, of course. Alex was the person looking after Oceans Group 1. I must say, I think Oceans had the most attractive backgrounds to the Padlets, all of these beautiful seafront views. Alex, tell us about your first session.
Thanks, Anthony. So for Oceans Group 1, we spoke a lot about the lighthouse initiatives, and there was a real kind of questioning of who is involved in deciding who demonstrators for the lighthouses would be. There's a real appetite among our group for citizens to be involved in shaping the discussions and making decisions about who got to be demonstrators for the lighthouses, and how you could have parallel processes where citizens were involved alongside experts. Other people mentioned that presidencies could be more involved in championing missions. So people mentioned France and Sweden as potential presidencies where they could make that a key plank of something that they wanted to champion. There was also a lot of talk about not wanting to reinvent the wheel, so trying to figure out where instruments or initiatives already exist throughout Europe, where countries could demonstrate that they were already aligning with the goals of the mission, and to kind of sense check as well whether or not the goals and targets were realistic, and to input into that kind of evaluation process. I think that about sums up the first board.
Okay, let me move across to the second. I just want to put a pin, and we'll come back to maybe the way in which presidencies are involved. Now, presidencies obviously are like the top level of the top in the European Council, and thinking about how the messaging of those sorts of presidencies runs really important. A blue ambition, I think that's a good example of how you can use some of those drivers from the top to push change and action further down. But what sort of structures and governance do you think might be needed?
So this was a really interesting discussion, and you can see we started to link things together a little bit more here. So we picked up that thread of citizen engagement, and that particularly we were thinking about how that would need to translate into transparency about the decision-making process around lighthouses, so that decisions were either open to challenge, or it would be clear where and how and why a decision had been made. There was also, it was also seen as a way of making it more felt on a national level, because it would enable people to talk about inland waters and how this wasn't just a remote issue, and how oceans couldn't just be ignored, but how inland waters really affected this whole conversation, and that would help nations and citizens engage with it. People also spoke about the mission board, which they shared some ideas about, and kind of got clarification on. On the right here, you'll see we split into talking about ideas for a macro regional level versus what countries could use on a national level, and you'll see there's some arrows connecting the two where there's structures which might overlap. So the participants drew attention to how governance structures of JPIs, for instance, often involve similar groups of people, and that those were already strong existing networks which could be used to tie the national and the macro regional discussions together. And there's a lot of discussion as well about what already exists in terms of regional initiatives. We had a lot of discussions about CSAs, and you can see there's a lot of acronyms in the middle towards the bottom here, where people have shared lists of various organizations for different regions which would need to be involved in shaping what a wider kind of more regional response might look like.
Okay.
Yeah, that's about it.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed, Alex. So I was facilitating the other session on oceans, and it was, unsurprisingly, quite a lot of the same kinds of issue came up. We were thinking about innovation that started from what was there already. I think one of the key themes in our session was that we needed to work with what was there to build on the existing arrangements. It's also really noticeable that that much like Alex's group talked both about the presidencies and about individual citizen action and making sure that people inland felt that the ocean was close to them. We talked about the need for citizens to feel part of this conversation, to be open to the conversation, and to help listen. In particular, connecting the populations that were far from the sea or didn't see the sea as part of their work, part of their lives, to those for whom it was much more immediate. Stakeholder engagement and citizen engagement was seen as a necessary process, but also a slow process. We have time, there's a few years in this program, but at the same time, it's something that needs to be started soon and delivered in a clear way, stepping through the different years. But there were lots of opportunities to take existing models. Things like the European Space Agency could be the model of a more connected approach on oceans within national and regional governments as well. Ocean-related policies are often split across multiple ministries or multiple departments. There's options there to try and create agencies or bring things together. In particular, there was the important, we mentioned the importance of looking at those places that were not Horizon Europe countries themselves, but which were affected by some of these decisions. So the Cape Verde Islands were mentioned. There'll be plenty of other places which are important stakeholders and where citizens and others are part of this conversation or could be part of this conversation, but aren't in the Horizon Europe network already. So we had a question, I suppose, a reflection on the need to balance the concreteness of the objectives and the certainty about what was being aimed for with the need for the mission to be big and inspiring and broad. And as we switched the conversation over to think a bit more about implementation structures and governance, we did start thinking about things that would enable quick connections or loose connections between different approaches and different ideas, whether it's a registry of best practice or a missions academy or certified locations that can demonstrate best practice or can act as partners in delivering ideas or in developing ideas further. There was definitely a sense that oceans was an area where we needed to build knowledge, build education, build information and awareness in the public, maybe more so than some of the other missions, which are a bit better understood, even if only at a very simple level. So there were opportunities both to engage citizens, but also to engage stakeholders in things like system demonstrators, in ocean prizes, in other kind of high-profile initiatives. But we're also very aware that citizen engagement is something that needs to involve a very broad area, collaboration between sectors, collaboration across all of the different actors who play their part is really essential, but we mustn't forget that some of the people who are most important, whether they're stakeholders or whether they're citizens, or whether they're businesses or others, don't see oceans as part of their remit. And they don't necessarily feel they have a need to or a permission to speak on this issue. How can we bring them in? How can we make sure that they feel confident enough to step up and confident enough to engage themselves? So that's my summary of my session on oceans. I'm sure you'll see there's a lot of crossover with Alex. So that covered oceans, and from oceans we moved to the final topic, which was soil. We had two groups again looking at that, and the first was with Maria. So Maria, can you tell us a bit about what your group thought about how countries and regions can contribute to the missions?
Thank you, Anthony. Yes, for soil, I hope I do our great discussions justice. But to start with the first question of how we can get countries and regions involved in contributing to the EU missions, this conversation, I believe that the main parts of the conversation focused around engagement, education, and resources. On engagement, we talked about how specifically how connections with citizens may be difficult on the topic of soil, and in order to engage effectively with different stakeholders, including the public, the wider public, the engagement needs to be done very carefully in different groups and approached as such. We talked about, in terms of engagement, we talked about the role of communication and the need for developing a cool logo, as one person put it, to actually give more of a central brand recognition, or perhaps not brand recognition, among a broader public of what the missions are, what the actual objectives are. Also to generate buy-in from different stakeholders. Speaking of different groups of stakeholders, some of the group members mentioned that farmers and consumers need to be connected with intensively as two very important members of the value chain in soil. We also talked about also around engagement, connecting engagement to education. We had a few ideas for how to connect education at the country level and the local level to the mission level. For example, through citizen science projects, competitions. We also had the lighthouses. The idea of lighthouses and live-in labs came up, not just as engagement and events to connect education within the countries to the missions, but also to connect across countries. We also, with regard to education, we came up against the sort of problem of how to connect actors' engagement with better with the larger initiatives at the mission level. And we talked a lot about actually the the ideas for how to connect countries and regions into the missions bled into the conversation into governance and structures. So,
okay, shall we switch over to that panel?
Sure. Yes. So on governance, there we are. So one of the key questions or the key issues that came up here was, well, three of them were around accessibility, transparency, and I think accountability. Again, I hope I'm doing this justice, but there are a lot of ideas and also observations around the need for a clearer, in order to effectively engage broader stakeholders around a topic as technical as soil. A lot of the group members were talking about ways to include, to clarify messages and narratives. What are the key goals and objectives, not just for individual missions, but for the broader initiative at large. In this way, we had the idea that also came from the morning session and it came up in other sessions prior, I understand, the idea of creating a platform that can sort of tick off a few of those issues, an online platform that can provide resources, also events, but also connect stakeholders. We also talked about on transparency, making sure perhaps through a platform or other modes of connecting national and regional hubs that already exist, to make information more readily available and information specifically about what's expected of different stakeholders that's connected to the broader narrative, of course. We talked about this other group. Also accountability. We had a few ideas for again connecting the different members of the value chain in terms of engagement, but also in terms of developing more a broader structure for monitoring. So bringing in companies and consumers into more to have better access to information, but also to be able to play a broader role of monitors in the process, but also in the actual work on the ground. I'd say.
Okay, that's great. A really rich conversation by the sounds of it, and I think that reconnecting, bringing back those conversations, feedback loops. I think there's some really common points there, but also some really interesting ones on soil specifically. So the last group we're going to go to is also about soil, and it was looked after by Saha. So Saha, can you talk us through the board from your perspective?
Yes, thank you, Anthony. We had a very, very lively discussion on both the questions actually, and from the first one, which was about how you could how countries and regions could contribute to the EU missions. I think one of the main points that came up was to align resources across member states, share research and best practices and other forms of local context that can be applied elsewhere, have healthy soil indicators that are, perhaps harmonized worldwide so that it's easy to be able to adopt easily in different contexts. And the one main point that kept coming back up was engagement with farmers, especially in terms of engaging with farmers on agricultural soil to better link soil management and the agrosystem productivity, and the need to be able to tailor these messages on agri-soil threats and cost benefits to farmers, as farmers are one of the main stakeholders in this case. And we also talked about some of the resources and how better reflections of the goals of the missions and the national programs could potentially analyze at the country level and also combine these resources to be able to contribute to the mission goals overall, and to be able to highlight these resource expectations for establishing or upgrading these living labs and lighthouse farms, as also Maria mentioned from her group earlier. And another point that someone mentioned was not to just focus on the member state or regional levels, but also take a look at things at a macro regional level focus too. So I think there was a lot of points that were very important, but also be able to align with each other.
Yeah, really interesting to think about the macro regions coming up here, but also coming up in the context of water. And obviously, city regions are very different beast, but still a connected thought. Thank you. Let's move on to the second session. So, what forms of governance and implementation structures did your group think were needed?
This was also a very lively discussion. I would say actually it was more lively because this is a new mission where we're still building it. So implementation structures and governance can be built up from the ground up. One of the more important points that came up was to establish structures on these lighthouses and living labs around both regional or national and also EU levels to make sure that these lighthouses are connected in terms of efficiency, and to also set up scientific committees and comparative networks to be able to work together on particular problems that different countries may face, and also focus on the local context, as that also changes from member state to member state. And another important point in terms of also engagement that came up was to support citizen science, and not only engages citizens, but also professional researchers and other stakeholders, and to be able to use citizen science as a tool. And it was important to engage citizens, farmers, consumers, SMEs and private companies, as someone pointed out as well, on discussing soil health, identification and financing of these solutions, and also sustainable food production. And to be able to that there was a need to spatially identify soil health in different similar structures, as you just mentioned in the water framework directive, and have these soil threat specific networks of multiple actors through national hubs and committees. And EIP agri operational groups could potentially be where all these end users and researchers, SMEs, farmers could potentially collaborate and find solution. I think the main point was to be able to collaborate with all of these actors who would otherwise not be able to work together and find solutions out of that.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Saha. So there's an enormous amount of richness there, and my task, which I'm happy to take on, but is a challenge, is to try to summarize some of those key points and to bring together some of the different strands that were talked about over the course of the session. So I think that the first thing I would say is that the connection between the missions and the other work that's going on at local level or in national level is really important. I think there's a strong connection between the stakeholder networks that are there, with local citizens conceptually. But I think one of the challenges that a lot of these conversations identified is turning something that is very big and very broad and deliberately hugely ambitious into something that speaks to people in their everyday lives, that speaks to people who are, who are citizens, that speaks to people who are farmers, who are working with water, working with soil, working on things that have consequences for health and for cancer. So there's quite a lot of different parts to that. There's quite a broad set of requirements that were coming out from those thoughts about infrastructure. In particular, we thought that there was thinking that the infrastructure needed to be flexible, needed to be networked, needed to be open. It needed not to stick too hard to rigid boundaries or to rigid models. At the same time, it needed to be common enough that it could be understood, and it needed to be approachable so that it wasn't this very heavy organization that people weren't able to access easily. I think there was really interesting range of thoughts about how we communicated the missions and about how these new infrastructures, or how nations and regions were able to support the communication of the missions. And they went right the way across the range. We talked about very, very local things. We talked about individual cities, individual places. We talked about the dealing with citizens, reaching citizens and voices that you might not otherwise hear. We talked about the people who might not see themselves as part of an oceans conversation because they live 200 miles from the sea. So it's quite a lot of very, very local, very granular, very networked sort of conversations going on. And at totally the other end of the spectrum, we talked about the presidencies. We talked about a blue mission presidency for the oceans. And similarly, you know, on climate change, we know there are huge plans in place. These are enormous, you know, communications campaigns, political campaigns, political shifts. So trying to connect those up, to use the energy that is driven by big political movements and by things like presidencies, things like the Green Deal, you know, using that as momentum to drive forward the mission and the awareness of the mission with people at local level and with stakeholders at local level. That feels like a really good thing to do if we can make the connecting infrastructure light enough, flexible enough, approachable enough. Using networks as hubs, using lighthouse approaches where, you know, people are where there's a, you know, real prominence for some particularly good examples. Thinking about how we do that now so that we can prepare what is going to be a multi-year engagement approach and a multi-year participation approach and a multi-year infrastructure setup. That's going to be really important. I think there was a real question for me about how we held some of those methods to account. I think my reflection listening to those conversations is of the enthusiasm that was in the rooms, of the passion and the commitment that people have for the programs that they want to work on and for the challenges they want to solve. And the missions model absolutely depends on that passion. It really depends on that commitment, because it is about setting a big goal and driving action together towards it. I think one of the challenges that missions bring by their very ambition is that they talk about things that everyone can agree with. They talk about things that are really clearly massively important challenges. And as those challenges get broken down into individual issues, into individual debates, into, you know, the everyday, then people may feel that's less exciting or less interesting, or even that, you know, oh, I want to do this set of things, but not that set of things. So trying to bind together a huge number of stakeholders and a huge number of actors in something as broad as a mission. We talked about climate city contracts in the context of climate and the context of cities as well, of course. But the question there is, you know, is it a good method for holding people to account? Is it a good method for bringing in bringing people in and saying, well, in 7 years' time, this is what we collectively have a goal to achieve. How can you help? I think there's definitely a question that came up in a few different places about the analysis of the gaps, about, you know, what don't we know that we don't know? Who are the people that we don't know that we don't know? Where are there places that we need to think about structures in a different way, or to think about outreach in a different way, or to think about connections in a different way? And I think the other point I'd make, which is related to that, is that the funding that is available for missions is really a small part of the social change that missions are trying to bring about, and that the research and the science and the thinking is as much about delivering the social change, and therefore the engagement and the voice and the impression that bends individual action, that bends state action, that bends other sources of funding, whether they're like funding for research or whether they're just the way in which money is spent or the way in which economies work. So there's an enormous amount of importance for the message of the missions, the mission of the missions, I suppose, to change some of those ideas. I think it's interesting to note the difference between some of those missions on how much the participants in the groups felt that people understood them. You know, I think there is a real difference between the level of understanding that people feel the public have about cancer and the level of understanding that people felt the public had about things like soil and oceans. And that's entirely understandable. And I think that one of the things that came out in a few of the different mission conversations was, how do you create a narrative that works for the public and a narrative that works for stakeholders, that enables them to see themselves in the missions, that enables them to say the missions are not just a statement that I agree with, are not just an inspiring goal, but they're also something that really has a direct impact on me and on which I can have a direct impact. So there's a really interesting couple of questions there, because if we don't have a call to action that's clear, and a couple of groups said, oh, we're not quite sure what the call to action is here, we're not quite sure what we're asking of people, then there's a risk that the missions don't inspire. And I think that inspiration to action is a really important part of this. I think that in thinking about some of the structures, the way in which the structure conversation in my group and talking to my facilitator colleagues in the break in the other groups as well, the structure conversation was a really powerful way of bringing the broad goals into relief and helping people think them through. So, you know, I think a couple of groups experienced that the question about what can nations and regions offer to the missions was almost a question that, you know, there's so many answers to, but, you know, they're the answers that everyone knows. You know, the countries and regions can be hubs, they can be connectors, they are obviously places with their own research agendas, their own organizational structures, their own system engagement approaches, and all of these are the basis on which the missions need to rest. But at the same time, you know, the countries and the regions are inherently part of the missions right up front. As soon as the conversation turns to, well, what do we do about it? What's the engagement approach that we need? What's the governance approach that we need? The conversation became quite concrete quite quickly, and people talked about individual ideas. They talked about models like the European Space Agency. Could there be a European Oceans Agency? You know, all of these things crystallized quite quickly. But one of the things that I noticed from that process was that what they crystallized into was a set of models for how you bring formal action together, whether research funding or government action, and then a broad and vaguer sense that you need something that connects up the pieces, that you need some kind of approach that joins up and reaches out beyond the normal, beyond the usual, beyond the stakeholders that are generally involved, into a much wider organization and to a much wider structure that could go bottom up and top down at the same time, rather than having to make a choice between those. Now, that is something where, you know, all of this is at an early stage. All of this is thinking about the near future, but still the future. And I think that one of the things that will be really interesting to develop a little bit further on the back of some of these conversations, perhaps, is what's there already. You know, the interconnection between the existing and the new, the interconnection between, you know, nations, regions, and the European missions. I think that's a really key thing that came out of this for me. But the thing I want to close on before handing on at the end of the session is that the range of views expressed was very broad. The number of ideas that came up was very broad, but behind it all, there was a really strong sense that the missions and the mission approach could drive a different sort of change, could drive a different kind of attitude, and one that then had consequences all the way down the system. But that in doing that, it's setting its own extremely difficult problem, a kind of meta mission connecting up all of the different missions, which is how do you take those big goals and connect them into existing systems? How do you take those big aspirations and connect them into the views of stakeholders and citizens? So there's obviously a lot more questions than answers in these boards, because we are, you know, we're asking for questions, we are asking for the issues. But I feel that, you know, my summary is the passion and the commitment is absolutely there to make some of these structures and governance arrangements work and come about. And there'll be some really interesting thinking, hopefully across the missions, but certainly within each mission, about how that interconnection for top-down and bottom-up involvement can work. So thank you again to everyone who took part, and thank you to my team of facilitators for holding that conversation, and to the colleagues from the different parts of the Commission for helping with practical, with technical advice, and for co-facilitating. I hope you all had a very productive and inspiring session that will give you ideas to go away with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I hope you can all see me and hear me. So I'm back, and your conclusions and your summary were extremely inspiring. I think it's obvious that the workshop has been a very important step in the development of the EU missions. It was conceived to have a very practical outcome, and that's exactly what happened. It gives a clear idea of possible structures, governance that we need to take us forward. At the same time, we hope that you got inspiration also from the discussions today, that it showed you how we could invest in mission-oriented approaches and how possible avenues could be developed to achieve this. The plenaries were full of rich information and context. We heard that the missions see as the main issues to be addressed at the country and local level joined up approach. but also that there are opportunities that they can present to countries and regions. We also, I believe, now understand better the position of some countries on our side and see the challenges that you are facing and that we will need to be tackling in order to implement the missions. I think it was very clear also from the summary that we've just heard from Anthony that research and innovation funding is only a small part of what is needed to deliver on the mission's objectives. We can take also lessons from past experience. We heard from the OECD, from the ERA approach. And thanks to the breakouts focusing on specific missions, we now have a much clearer idea of the next steps that we need to take in order to move ahead with this very exciting project. I would like also perhaps to highlight so that this very event and the way it took place was an excellent example of co-creation, which is the working method by default that we want to have for those missions. This is at the heart of the concept of missions. It's not an easy approach, but we've seen the advantages of following it, and we are learning as we are going and improving it on the way. You are well aware, I believe, of the timeline for missions. We are now working on the implementation plans within the European Commission. We hope that we can have a Commission internal assessment before the summer and that we can come back with proposals for work program amendments in the autumn in order to roll out the full-fledged implementation of the missions. That's what we are thinking about the next steps. We will be in touch with you, of course, all along the way. And perhaps to conclude on a slightly different note, I would like to invite you for the last time to connect to Slido and to tell us in one word, what is your main takeaway of the event? And the words that you are typing will appear on the wall of words on the screen. Again, thanks a lot to all of you. We look forward to continuing this work with you. And I hope we can now open the Slido and see on the screens already the words popping up. Yes, it's a bit smallish, but I can read engagement as the main word. The rest is really too small. Complexity. Well, we'll try to make it a bit simpler, and a lot of other words that perhaps you have a better sight than me to look at. So with these, dear colleagues, thanks a lot for your commitment, for your engagement, and for your active participation in the workshop today. We are drawing from it a lot of very concrete recommendations and food for thought to further reinforce the joined-up approach for the implementation of missions, which is indeed quite a complex, multi-level, multi-stakeholder engagement along the next years. Thanks a lot, and looking forward to continuing that work with you. Have a good evening to all of you.